You're listening to the 20th broadcast of TBR Radio's, the TBR History Hour. With your host, TBR contributing editor, Dr. Edward DeVries. On today's show, Dr. Ed continues his conversation with TBR executive editor, Paul Angel, about the May-June issue of the Barnes Review magazine. Ed and Paul discuss the legacy of Henry Ford, the history of pandemics, the absurd suggestion that Adolf Hitler was a stooge of the Zionist elite, and World War II spycraft.
On page 30, John Weir had an article, and he talks about Henry Ford, the great American industrialist and inventor who's been smeared beyond belief, and he says that basically he's going to set the record straight.
Well, most of our readers know about Henry Ford, and they also know that, of course, he was the publisher of the Dearborn Independent, which published portions of the protocols and was very critical of the behavior of the Jewish/Zionist elite, the banking system. He did not consider, he divided Jews into two categories. So there were what some people might say the little ones and the big ones. And he had a lot of Jewish employees who thought he was one of the fairest and most equitable employers possible. But his, we'll call them anti-Semitic columns in the Dearborn Independent, as well as his focusing on the protocols, which he thought were completely genuine, got him into real trouble. Some U.S. congressmen blasted Ford as having ruined his career and all this stuff. I mean, Ford was a mover and shaker at the time. He knew some of the biggest people around. He was great friends with Alva Edison. He knew that the famous guy Burbank, right? What was his name? Luther Burbank, right? He was a botanist and an inventor. And I mean, he was, of course, what the great thing about Ford we know is, and I think he could be, his approach could be used today, is that he believed that the profits of a company were as much deserved to be placed, at least portions of it, in the hands of the hardworking employees he had who deserved an honest wage and products that they could afford, as did the soft-handed executives sitting at the boardroom table. Of course, people didn't like that he paid his employees so well, or that he wanted to make a car, for instance, that everybody could afford. It kind of reminds you of, say, Adolf Hitler with the Volkswagen, so that the average person could have what the rich had. And so, obviously, you're not going to, rich industrialists and others, and the way we look at our CEOs today, who, I saw, here's an example of an anti-Ford type of, or opposite of Ford approach. Some major company, I forget which one it was, decided they were going to fire, 20% of their workforce from this COVID thing when they were sitting on maybe trillions in assets, but that the upper level management would take a pay cut. Okay, well, they don't really need the money. They could probably survive for decades off the money they have in the bank, while the people they're laying off are going to suffer massively. I doubt Ford would have taken that approach to this whole thing. And fascinating, of course, Henry Ford was also honored by the German government. In 1938, we got a photo here of Ford receiving the Grand Cross of the German Eagle. And it was the highest award that a foreigner could receive. And he got it when he was 75 years old. And Hitler was an admirer of Ford. Obviously, that got him into a little bit of trouble as well, because any type of anything but pure condemnation of the German efforts to revitalize their economy and their industry, self-sufficiency. It reminds me of today, right? I mean, anybody who's going to be talking about pulling out of China, at least the industrialists who have their love the slave labor of the Chinese worker, is going to be attacked and vilified. Oh, yes, and of course, Henry Ford was a smart guy, but he wasn't a book learning guy. Matter of fact, I forget, he said something like, textbooks are of no use to me. I'm more interested in solving problems. And so we have a list of some of his famous quotes. I'll read a couple of them. It says, you can't build a reputation on what you're going to do. I see too many people today, and especially in our movement, talk, and never do. And in all businesses, I suppose, this is why people who can solve problems are the ones that are really valuable to corporations. So he also said, for instance, don't find fault, find a remedy. Anybody can complain. How true that is. And the only mistake is the one from which we learn nothing. Henry Ford was one who liked to go into various different businesses when he was a young man about things he knew nothing about. He felt like failing along the way taught him so much it was well worth it. He said obstacles are those frightful things you see when you take your eyes off your goals. When everything seems to be going against you, remember that the airplane takes off against the wind, not with it. And he also said, quality means doing it right when no one is looking, which is so true as well. Students, lazy students, of course, are very good when the teacher's standing over their shoulder, but it's what they do in their own time, unsupervised, is really makes the difference between a success and a failure. Chop your own wood, it will warm you twice. And so we have an interesting collection of quotes, plus a great number of intimate discussions of the life of Ford. I will say one thing about Ford that surprised me was I know he didn't like book learning, but when he was sued, he was accused of being an anarchist, and I think they called him a dummy or something. Well, he sued for libel. When they took him to court, they asked him some questions, and one of the questions was, what's chili con carne, right? And Ford said he thought it was a mobile Mexican army. And so he didn't know too much about that. In the end, by the way, he won that lawsuit, only won $1, but they proved that, yeah, he didn't know too much about the history of the United States. For instance, he thought the Revolutionary War was fought in 1812, but that didn't take away from the common sense the guy had. He won $1, but they kind of proved to court that he wasn't much on book learning, but he certainly was no anarchist. So a shame he didn't win more money. But his effect on U.S. industry and America in general was just great. And the guy ought to be looked upon once again for his accomplishments and how he transformed our opinion of American workers and the value that they have, as opposed to his comments on what he thought about Jews in general. So, but like I said, you said, we've always said it before, if you cross the line and become politically incorrect, you're pretty much written out of history. So I imagine anything to do with Henry Ford, even the Henry Ford Foundation likes to disassociate from him now. So that's another good article just to let you know what Henry Ford was really about. And he certainly isn't what you're going to see in politically correct publications who talk about nothing but his discussion of Jewish involvement in the banking industry and industry in general, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, when I was a kid, my grandfather had a 1930 Model A Ford. He worked for the Ford Motor Company. He got his job actually, during the 1920s. He said that on his 5th anniversary of working in the Ford plant, that Henry Ford came down to the floor there to personally congratulate him for his 5th anniversary with the company. And basically told him, he said, you see these cars coming off the assembly line? He said, you just tell me which one you want. And my grandfather picked a tan sedan, a Model A sedan, and Henry Ford said, okay, that's your car. And he told all the workers, he said, okay, this is Ed's car. You know, he got to tell the different people on the different parts of the line if he wanted anything, different than ordinary or whatever on it. And he drove that car home that afternoon.
Well, there you go. That's a great anecdote for how Henry Ford truly was and how he cared about his employees.
There was another article. It was a bonus issue, so it wasn't paged. It was B1, B2, B3, and so forth, as opposed to a page number. I guess it's not technically part of the magazine, although it's right in the middle of the magazine. And it's an article that I had actually written, and the reason I didn't submit it was because you had sent me a copy of it, and I thought, man, how in the world did John manage to write, my article before I did? But it was practically the same article that I had written. So, all I could say is great minds must think alike. But, basically it was the history of pandemics, throughout history.
Is the purpose of that, by the way, it's called Pandemics, how they've changed the course of history. And it was placed in the center of the magazine so people might be able to pull it out past those staples and hand it around. John Tiffany, the editor, put that together. And the purpose of that was really to show people that human beings throughout history have lived through lots of pandemics which are, I think, much scarier than this one. And so as we go through them, of course, they started way back in history. back to, the first ones that recorded are from 430 BC in the Athenian plague. We don't even know what some of these plagues were. They suspect they were this. They could have been typhoid. We had the Cyprian plague of 250 to 550 AD. And this one would have diarrhea, vomiting, throat ulcers, fever, gangrene in the hands and feet. This could be been the plague, the bubonic plague. And how they would pass from Ethiopia, be carried by the armies, come through. You had the Antonine plague of 165 AD to 180. You had the plague of Justinian. You had, by the way, that was the outbreak of the bubonic plague. And that basically afflicted the Byzantine Empire and Mediterranean port cities. Killed about 25 million people initially, but it would recur and come back. And of course, there's also the purpose in these small paragraphs that are related to this report will also tell you what the effect on history was. For instance, the plague of Justinian changed the course of the empire. I mean, it's pretty much stopped Emperor Justinian's plans to bring the Roman Empire back together and caused massive economic chaos. It also may have been so apocalyptic, right, that it spurred the rise in Christianity. So these plagues had great effect on history. We had leprosy. Remember, you don't even see that nowadays. Pretty much, it's made a comeback here and there. But you had that in the pandemic in the 11th century. You had the Black Death from 1348 to 1353, where like as many as 200 million people were killed. We're talking 1/3 of the world's population at the time. And so what I want people to understand is, again, I say that fear is the tool that the media uses against us and the global elite, and of course the media only being their tool, to forge us into the willing slaves that they want us to be for the most part. Not to wax poetic too much, but it's true. And so people need to remember the yellow fever epidemic stuff. These are just from like 1800 to 1803. Or the cholera epidemics. 150 years we had these cholera epidemics. 1 million people died of cholera in Russia. British soldiers were taken into India and Africa and China, Japan, Spain, Italy, Germany, America. We had a third cholera pandemic just about before the Civil War. Of course, as you've pointed out, dysentery killed what, millions or tens of thousands at least of people during the Civil War era, and we know that more soldiers in the Civil War died of disease than died from their battle wounds. We had bubonic plague popping up again in the 1855s to 1860s, and of course now I still don't quite understand this. Viruses don't kill. I've heard a lot of lectures from people that say viruses are good for you. Viruses cleanse your body. And what happens is sometimes your body's too old and weak to take it, and it turns on itself, and these turned into allowing bacterial infections like pneumonia to get into your lungs. But take the 1875 Fiji measles epidemic. This was, of course, the Fijians had never seen the measles, and the Fijian royal party shows up to Australia to pay a visit, and they come across the measles. So they bring that back to their island, where it soon spread all across the island. And it was littered with corpses. They were just, the wild animals were just eating them up, right? Entire villages died. Whatever little settlements they had died. Homes were burned. And because the Fijians were so scared this was going to spread, that they would burn them with the sick people alive inside. 40,000 people, or 1/3 of the island's population, died. So now I ask you, if viruses don't kill, then what killed these people in Fiji? Because they were healthy. Kind of like my point about the American Indian. They were healthy, they were eating good food, they were in very good physical shape, but they come across measles or smallpox or influenza and they die in huge numbers. Then what is killing them? These people whose immune systems are in perfect condition. So I don't quite understand how viruses don't kill. Someone will really have to explain that to me, and somebody there listening will know. And they'll try to explain it to me, and I still won't get it. It's so complicated. But anyway, that being said, that was a good example of how an unimmune population was encountered the measles and was nearly wiped out. You had the Russian flu in 1889 and 90. And you had a sixth cholera pandemic in the early 1900s before the Spanish flu. You had the Asian flu epidemic in 1956 through 1958. Excuse me, I skipped over the Spanish flu in 1918. Of course, that may have started in China, and we call it the Spanish flu, and I get it, why the Spaniards are so up in arms. But if you look at the number of these epidemics and pandemics that start. So many of them started in China. The third bubonic plague in 1855 to 1860 started in China. And I guess it's because they're so jam-packed together. We know that the domestication of animals allowed some of these viruses to jump from pigs and cattle and sheep and goats and chickens, right? Avian flus. You had the Asian flu pandemic of 1956 to 1958. Not that far long ago. That was H2N2. It killed about 1.1 to 2 million people. 116,000 died in the United States. Okay, so think about that. We're at 65,000 now, with 120,000 projected to die here. What did we do in 1956 to 58? Does anybody remember the Asian flu pandemic when almost 120,000 Americans died? Did we shut down the industry? No, a vaccine was developed. And I also get calls about that because I'm pro and con, as I mentioned. And I don't know how long it took, but it must have taken within that period of 56 to 58 about a year and a half.
So then does that prove my point that even if 2% of the U.S. population dies, it'll be nothing more than, or even 2% of the world's population dies, that it would be nothing more than a footnote in history?
Yes. That's kind of the point of this whole thing, is that we've been through a lot. It was like my reference to kids who were scared after 9/11 and me telling them, well, you didn't live through the 60s and 70s when we had 700 terror bombings by the Weather Underground and the Puerto Ricans and the Black Panthers, or politicians. Our president was killed, senators were killed, senators were shot, preachers were killed, right? Black activists were killed, white activists were killed. Bill Ayers was running around. Like, don't let them convince you that we haven't been through this before and we can't get over it again. But to look at that Asian flu pandemic, and we all think of the 50s as the great era of America, right? Well, for 2.5 years, we're having 120,000 people die in this country, 1.1 to 2 million in the world. But did anybody go nuts and start blaming people and thinking about whose fault it was? Or were they reacting fast enough? Listen, our leaders probably do the best. I'm not a conspiracy theorist who's going to go so far as to say China released this on purpose to destroy the world economy and punish the United States, blah, blah, blah. You know, you got to be a real, one of those rare killers in history like Stalin, who's willing to kill 20, 30, 40 million people. They're few and far between. I don't think President Xi over in China is the kind of guy who would sacrifice, even though it would be probably to the best interest of their country, to sacrifice. I don't know how many people have died over there. They're alleging tiny little numbers, but I guarantee you it's got to be in the 50, 60, 70,000 if he's just going to throw them out there, if he's evil like that. But anyway, off the point. But that is a perfect example of a time when we lost 120,000 people in the course of those 2 years. And I don't even remember. You said a footnote in history. I don't even know if I got a footnote. It was the first time I could really heard about it. By the way, we know that as late as 1968, we had the Hong Kong flu. Right? So this pandemic killed about 1 million, including 500,000 people in Hong Kong. 500,000 people. We all make jokes about the Hong Kong flu and Hong Kong Phooey, the cartoon character, right? Yeah. 1968, man. And of course, we have today things that people don't even think about, like Lyme disease. And this is a serious little thing, right? They think that 114 people in the United States have died from it from 1999 to 2003. There is no cure. There is nothing for it yet. Yet I know all of my farming cousins who live in Maryland, 30, 40 people all have Lyme disease. It gives them those the muscle aches and tiredness, and then, of course, we have mad cow, right? We don't even know what that is. That's that crazy spongiform, bovine spongiform encephalopathy, right? And that's so bad we don't even like to import our beef yet. Oops, we can bring in beef from Namibia now, as we're slaughtering millions of our own cattle, which is strange. 231 cases, what they call Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. And the AIDS pandemic, right? By the way, there's some very interesting information about Fauci, and he made his claim to fame with the AIDS research. But anyway, it seems like it's killed about 36 million people. And for a while there, we would have called that the deaths of the deplorables, right? Because it was only homosexuals were getting it. But then we started seeing it in the blood supply and transfusions. And so there are some scientists who say there's a lot more in our blood than we want to admit. And there's also just a great debate about vaccines and HIV and the whole thing. And of course, you had the SARS epidemic. That was just 17 years ago. Now, SARS, I'll call it SARS-CoV-1. And now we have SARS-CoV-2 or CoV-2. I guess that's COVID. This is the severe acute respiratory syndrome. And so that's what we really have here. Okay, now we were so worried about this, it hit 26 other countries. Now, I guess this wasn't as communicable as the one we have now, because either that or China did a better job in containing it. It did go to 26 countries, and it did infect 8,096 people. There was only 774 deaths. But we don't even know. How do we even know, considering the way the numbers are being given to us about this COVID, as to whether people are really dying from their body turning on themselves, whether they had bad hearts, did they have heart attacks, did they have pneumonia, was it caused by this, was it not caused by this, did they have diabetes, were they just obese? As I say, I probably have 10 underlying causes. Who knows, right? But anyway, that seemed to have contained, of course, we had the swine flu epidemic from Barack Obama's era. I don't even remember anybody they whispered about swine flu. It popped up a little bit. This was April 2009. Obama did declare a national emergency. And they thought this was going to be a massive global pandemic. They said it emerged from Mexico. All right. I doubt it. Probably got to Mexico from China, but I shouldn't say that without knowing. But evidently, swine flu killed about 12,500 Americans. But again, who knows how they were counting them then? It could have been 60,000 for all I know. Maybe they weren't counting every single COVID death, or COVID was not that. Every swine flu death every death is a swine flu death. I have no idea. I just know this. Thank goodness that this isn't Ebola, because the last on our list, of course, is the Ebola epidemic of 2014 to 2016. Now, this is a super deadly viral disease, right? It looks horrible. And this is in the center of Africa and Congo and then South Sudan there. And they believe that this was caused by human contact with wildlife. Maybe bats, could have been eating some bush meat, right? Non-human primates. And of course, Obama was very reluctant to restrict travel to the U.S. from Africa. I think we got lucky. But imagine if this was Ebola. All right, here, what's my point? My point is, every year in the United States, 50,000 people die approximately, sometimes 75, sometimes 25, of just influenza. Nobody batted an eye about this before, when 75,000 people would die. And so one thing I think we have learned is that we're not very good at battling the common cold or influenza. And maybe this is going to help us stop just our regular influenza deaths during the course of the year. I understand if you have the flu and wear a mask, and everybody who had the flu and realized they had the flu wore a mask, you cut down deaths of influenza in general by 70%. So, I don't want to go to I don't think we have to close down businesses and all, but I do believe, and this ties me back to something you didn't mention, which was the editorial I wrote. And which editorial, I've had multiple people request thousands of copies of this already to hand out in their cities. It's been the most requested editorial in the history of the Barnes Review. But if the news media had wanted to, and I have a feeling if Trump had been president during the swine flu or the SARS epidemic, that we would have had a panic, because they would have wanted to show you how horrible this guy was allegedly at handling this. And I think that the very fact that anywhere from 25 to 35 to 50 to 75,000 Americans die every year from influenza, we could have created a panic in a year in the past 100 years, simply by concentrating on the deaths and not the recoveries. So anyway, that wrapped up our pandemic coverage. We may do more in our next issue about the WHO, history of Dr. Fauci, just to see. I don't think Fauci is a villain. I just think that sometimes people see the opportunity for power and profit. And I don't know how you feel about it, but something about Dr. Fauci I don't trust. I could be completely wrong. But anyway, we may have a little bit more about pandemics and history and some of the more specific things you had mentioned, possibly an article on the effect of dysentery on history. We know that battles have been won and lost on illness of leaders going in. Wasn't Napoleon affected by an intestinal problem at the Battle of Waterloo or one of the big battles and arrived a little bit late. And wasn't Robert E. Lee possibly hurt with or affected with a heart attack? Possibly, or at least heart problems at the Battle of Gettysburg. Here, a 70-year-old man's riding a horse all day long in 100-degree heat in a wool uniform. Well, I'm amazed that he could do what he did anyway. But so think of the number of things that have been affected by disease, and think of also, how other times in history we've handled this much differently. I just bring up that one that killed 120,000 Americans, that Asian flu pandemic of the 50s. Never even heard of it. But no one's ever going to forget COVID-19.
Well, did you read the article that I had sent you? I know you said you sent it on to John Friend because he's possibly, collecting some articles for the next issue. But, I was going through all of the crazy things that our ancestors did in response to the various pandemics of history. But yet, when you compare them to what the leaders of our country and our world are doing today, maybe rubbing horse poop on your chest isn't so crazy. At least it doesn't crash your economy.
Who knows? And I think that one of the either casualties or victors in this thing is going to be alternative health. Of course, they think taking vitamin C and zinc and all this stuff is ridiculous, even though I've just listened to a long lecture from a virologist who says that ain't a cure, but certainly building your immune system with olive leaf extracts and vitamin C and zinc and magnesium and other supplements, and even drinking just tonic water. Yes, she said even small amounts of quinine can be helpful to you.
Well, there was a big typhoid epidemic that was sweeping through the world during the war between the states, and the reason it didn't wipe out both armies was because both armies were administering quinine in massive quantities, and the soldiers were the healthy ones, where the rest of the world wasn't.
That brings up a related subject about hydroxychloroquine. Of course, Trump mentions it, and immediately it's slammed as ineffective in this study or whatever, partial studies. I just saw a recent report from doctors that said they don't know about hydroxychloroquine yet, but they did say that in a real live clinical test, 91% of people given it early in the process recovered faster, much like this resveratrol or whatever the heck they're talking about. I don't even know what the name of that thing is. It's this new one that I think that China may have patented slightly after this thing broke, which is coincidental. But anyway, so I said my neighbor comes out. My neighbor is a real hater of Trump, and just anything that a Democrat does is perfect, and everything a Republican does is just pure evil. But he says, "Hey, you see those dummies out there who took the fish tank cleaner? Because that's what hydroxychloroquine, I guess, is listed as one of the possible ingredients in fish tank cleaner, even though it's been used safely for lupus and malaria and arthritis, I believe, if taken properly."
Well, the reason they use it as fish tank cleaner is it gets into the water. And then, of course, the fish, might have certain illnesses, and the fish, of course, are ingesting the drug.
Right. So anyway, the guy says to me, he said, "Did you hear about that? Your president's so stupid." And I'm like, "Look, I'll criticize Trump when he's wrong, and I praise him when he's right. I'm not a Trump lover, but I better than the options." And I said, "But I'll bet you that they were Democrats." And the guy goes, "They weren't Democrats." Well, I just saw a report that the husband who died and the wife who did not, the wife is being investigated according to a local newspaper for murder. She may have put the stuff in his food and killed him. And yes, she was a donor to Barack Obama, so I just thought it was funny. But anyway, the point is that these things need to be discussed and talked about. And so for the news media to just slam down on this, and if Trump came up with the idea, and he has said some dumb stuff, let's be honest, he's just not a virologist. And he's also working probably 17, 18 hours a day, and while they're sitting at home in their mansions talking about whether it's safe to come back. I thought Congress was considered essential. Well, I guess they're admitting that they're not essential if they don't want to come back to work, in which case, who needs them? But anyway, he's handled this thing nearly by himself, I would say, with his advisors, of course. But anyway, that was just a side story on the fact that alternative health could be a winner here, or it could be a loser. How could it be a loser? It could be a loser if they censor everything about it and start to smash these poor guys who are just, they're not selling nutty stuff. They're selling vitamin C, like I said, and and magnesium and CoQ10, which we know even doctors recommend now for people on statins because it depletes CoQ10 levels in your body, and your heart needs that. And so we'll see how that goes. But like again, the news media, Mark Zuckerberg, Facebook, the internet outlets can all be censored so easily now. Which brings back to I have to mention the importance of print publications. They still, at this particular point in time, can't be stopped if they're being mailed by the U.S. Post Office. So be careful. You might get more truth in a print publication than you do anywhere online. At least this stuff is vetted and it can't be censored.
Open your web browser and type in www.barnesreview.org and discover the Barnes Review magazine. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There is no more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review magazine in its print form, or in convenient electronic delivery. Our host has been a subscriber to both formats for years. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review.
The next article in the magazine is called The Uranium Club and talks about a German scientist named Karl Weizsäcker, who in 1941 he filed for a patent for a plutonium bomb that was supposed to be the most powerful explosive device that had ever been created. And of course that patent was kept secret, but it establishes that the Nazis were working on nuclear weapons even at the beginning of the war. I'm going to put a question out there and you can answer it for us. What if the Germans had actually perfected that bomb and they actually did start the war off with an atomic weapon? Of course, you know, their scientists were then brought to the United States to help the Americans develop what would become their atomic weapon. But what if the Nazis actually started the war with the atomic weapon and they realized just how barbaric it was to set one of these things off, and that Adolf Hitler could have, but chose not to do the thing that Harry Truman was eager to do at the end of the war?
Well, that's a big if, because if Hitler would have done that, looking at his views on, say, poison gas and bombing the civilian centers, he would have set it off in some seriously remote place of the world just to show what it could do. I don't think he would have dropped it on any type of populated center or anywhere else. They weren't that close, though. They were the leaders at the time by far. And had the war not happened, they would have developed a nuclear weapon. So saying that what would have happened if, well, they were a long way off. They would have gotten there had not their rail lines been destroyed and their laboratories been destroyed and had to go underground to build these facilities. There's no doubt that inevitably they would have developed a nuclear weapon. But here in the United States, we had such open spaces like in the American Southwest to have these labs unbombed, uninterrupted research, access to other scientists. Of course, we made great progress once the Nazi scientists came over here. But you know, I don't know. I think Hitler might have made a demonstration of it had this happened. Again, this is a completely hypothetical situation. I just know at the beginning of the war, they were leaps and bounds ahead of us, and the only thing that stopped them was the absolute destruction of Germany, and which is why they moved some of these research facilities right to underground facilities in other countries. But the story itself is very interesting. We've had a great debate here at the Barnes Review over the years. Were they close? Were they not? Did they have it? Could they have done it? They had the rocketry possibly to deliver it? They certainly could have advanced their rocketry program to carry nuclear weapons far enough. Nobody's really scared that Kim Jong-un has nuclear weapons. What they're really worried about, does he have the capability to deliver them far enough to threaten us, which is certainly easier to do probably than a nuclear weapon. But this is a 7,000 word story and highly detailed and based upon multiple sources, just to let you know that the Germans were probably not close. They probably could have dropped a dirty bomb, a radiological weapon, but they were not ready that particular point in time with the obstacles they have overcome with the destruction of their infrastructure to be able to have finished making this bomb. But I would tell you this, what the United States government and the U.S. troops found when looking for this and the reactors that they were working on was impressive. Of course, a few years back, there was people always like to say the Nazis would have had this to scare you. Oh my God, what if Hitler would have had a weapon? He would have dropped it on New York. Doubtful. I just don't think so. But that being said, they'll find some guys who make some wild claims and make a big deal about it. And our author in this particular one, Arthur Kemp, who is the author of March of the Titans and founder and president of Ostara Publications, which can be found online, which has lots of great publications that he takes and resuscitates and resets in a beautiful book form and writes his own forwards to, a real live scholar here. Really went through this in a highly illustrated article as well to give you exactly where they were, how far they'd come, and how close they were. Again, had this been peacetime and they were working on this, there's no doubt that they would have beaten us by a decade or more, probably more, although who knows, we may have stolen the technology from them in the end, as the Chinese do from us today. But that's an article you need to read for yourself because it deals with every myth and fact about the German World War II nuclear program in immense detail from multiple sources. That's a real must read for those who are wondering about that particular subject, which we do get a lot of letters on. And again, we have a great debate amongst our own readers. As a matter of fact, I think Guillermo Rudolph was pretty sure that they had a radiological weapon and that some of the people that they were burying at outside one of the concentration camps were actually victims of a test of a radiological weapon, not an atomic weapon. And I think they say they're Jewish victims, but they in fact were German civilians or German workers who were killed in great numbers from the explosion of a radiological weapon.
Extra, extra, read all about it.
If you're like me, and I'll bet you are, you like to be on the cutting edge of honest news and accurate information. 26 times a year, the American Free Press newspaper can be delivered to your door, packed with the kind of uncensored news that I know you're going to appreciate. If you're ever dissatisfied with your subscription to the American Free Press, their guarantee is that you just drop them an email and they will gladly refund the unused portion of your subscription. So what are you waiting for? Visit www.americanfreepress.net. Once again, www.americanfreepress.net. And find out about the American Free Press. Do it today.
Extra, extra, read all about it.
And then there's another article after that one, and it's by John Friend. And, of course, you've all heard the saying that is so absurd, that is so ludicrous, that I'm not even going to dignify it with a response. And, of course, the accusation has been made that Hitler was nothing but an unwitting tool of the Zionist elite. Why did John Friend choose to even dignify something so absurd with a response?
Because that particular claim that Hitler was a stooge of the Zionists comes up every so often, as does the claim that Stalin really wasn't that bad a guy. He was just manipulated and didn't really know how many people were being killed. When you hear this coming up and people starting to repeat it, you need to go back and set the record straight. And in the beginning of this program, you mentioned that the West had funded Hitler and built Hitler up. Of course, they were hedging their bets. And as you'll notice that the particular action committees here and lobby groups will donate to both Republican and Democratic candidates to make sure that they're supporting the winner. So Hitler did get a lot of money from sources that people could question and say, oh, look, he was funded by the Zionists. Well, you'll notice they were also funding other political parties as well to hedge their bets. But this has just come up again recently, and this guy, Bjerknes, I'm not sure how you pronounce his name, it's Bjerknes. He is a Jewish writer, and his blog is known as Jewish Racism. So he is critical of some Jewish behavior and laudatory of others, I imagine, but he had authored a book on the Armenian genocide, and he also made the claim, as P. Papa Heracles wrote an article years ago for us about Ataturk and the Turks, and specifically in relationship to the Greek genocide and the population transfer and how the Greeks treated the Turks and how the Turks treated the Greeks, which is completely different. He also questions about Albert Einstein's pilfering of brilliant ideas. Well, obviously, nationalists love to hear from Jewish sources if we're criticizing the same thing, and it just adds some gravitas to claims, the claims they're making, because it can't be considered anti-Semitic. So anyway, this guy has come up with this thing, and as well as others, including Henry Makow, who's a prolific Jewish internet, I'll call him an entrepreneur, but he runs a website. And he's got some great books. I mean, Henry has some absolutely fantastic stuff, but he too has jumped on this. And then people like to repeat it. Critics of Hitler, for instance. And they call Hitler the father of Israel, for instance. And basically, I think what we know now is Hitler was critical of his Jewish population. And by the way, a lot of Jews, as we've said before, fought in the Wehrmacht. But he wanted them to leave. He saw them as parasitic, and that was the truth. You read Mein Kampf, and you'll get his real opinions on Jews and Judaic behavior, or the religion, or the race, whatever you want to call it. But anyway, it just came back up again, and we saw people repeating it. And when people get outraged, and John Friend was outraged by this, and so he just wanted to set the record straight once again. And it may have to be written again in a few years, for all I know.
Right. On page 67, there was a little brief article here, basically about how a Congressman, Thomas Massey of Kentucky, had said that the Trump stimulus package was going to be the largest transfer of wealth in the history of the world, and it was not going to be a good one.
People that stand up for things and take responsibility for it, you got to respect. Now, Massey stood up and said this and actually delayed the stimulus package, which a lot of people were really mad about. But he was the one guy who did it. Now, recently, I mentioned Ocasio-Cortez, the congresswoman from New York, who objected to the passage of one of these stimulus bills. But she knew she wasn't the person holding it up. She just wanted to be on the record that this all was not going to the people, and she's for the masses. And but she knew that her vote was not going to hold that thing up. This guy knew that if he called for a return of congressmen to Washington, D.C., that this could delay this and he could become a villain. But he stood by what he believed as long as he could. I think he ended up caving and not calling for people to come back and vote. And I'm not even sure his vote would have made a difference. It wasn't close, right? But, you got to respect a guy like that. And so, but Trump was so irritated, I didn't call for his ouster from the Republican Party. So we'll see. Once again, we'll never know the truth of this. This was the $2.2 trillion stimulus package. And from what I've seen, I saw a massive amount of this money went to the banks who were sitting on, again, and other groups, sitting on trillions of dollars of assets. And only, let's say, 500 billion of it went to the little guy. I've known a few small companies who have gotten their checks. A couple printers I know have gotten maybe about 50 grand so they can continue to pay their employees past a certain date. They're not sure if they'll have to pay this back or whatever. But the idea that, like, Chase Manhattan, which was sitting on trillions in assets, and Capital One, Bank of America, and Wells Fargo got this huge amount of money, which I don't think they're ever going to give back to us. They're probably going to invest it in the stock market after it dipped and then take it out when it gets high again and cause another crash. But anyway, the fact that they got all that, and that by the way, I don't even know nobody who's gotten a stimulus check yet. These $1,200 checks. I know nobody who's received a check yet.
I'll say I haven't got one.
No, and you need it. Okay. So with $1,200, I mean, readers know that might buy you some groceries, some gas, and your mortgage for 1 month. So hopefully Massey was wrong, but I'm not sure he was. It's one of these bills you have to sign it to read it. It's ridiculous.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say $1,200 wouldn't pay your rent on an apartment in Orlando for a month. So
no, as a matter of fact, it wouldn't pay for it in Stafford, Virginia, because I was shocked to find out when I was trying to build a smaller house out in the middle of nowhere here that apartment rents were double what a mortgage is. Yeah. But anyway, that being said, these bills that they sign, you got to ask yourself, okay, We couldn't come up with the money for an infrastructure program like China has that, as I mentioned earlier, that massive Belt and Road thing with the roads and the other bridges and centers and industrial centers and cultural centers. And you're like, we couldn't come up with that here, but we come up with $3 or $4 trillion. Well, why couldn't we just come up with $3 or $4 trillion for our own Belt and Road project here, which could be employing, not everybody is unemployed, certainly, but there's other, and not everybody wants to build roads and do that hard construction work. But my gosh, along the way, there's jobs for administrators and secretaries and phone answerers and inspectors and surveyors, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, how many people could that employ? And where'd the money come from?
Not to mention the fact that you also have jobs in steel mills and concrete factories
Absolutely.
and construction companies and fabricating shops and who knows how many other industries feed that road construction.
Sure, or even, like I said, could be cultural centers or beautiful bridges and opera houses along the way, and small cities and facilities for the workers. It just seemed like a natural. But anyway, okay, so it takes the COVID-19 for us to print up $3 trillion because there isn't $3 trillion here. I don't know where they think they're getting this from. This is nothing but funny money, and it's all being borrowed at interest from the Federal Reserve. So it's just a disaster. So in the end, probably Massey was correct.
Welcome to the Christendom curriculum. You know, every parent who decides to homeschool wants to secure a great education for their child, while also saving time and money. But these days, many parents have another concern. They also want a homeschool curriculum without all the multiculturalist, politically correct diversity doctrine that's really little more than a thin disguise for an anti-Christian, anti-American, and anti-Western civilization bias. Now there is such a curriculum. The Christendom curriculum gives your children a complete education in Bible, history, literature, and more, focusing on the classic academic skills of reading, writing, and arithmetic. But we also tell the story of Christendom, the story of the Christian nations, especially as Christ's kingdom has been historically manifest in the nations of Europe and America, and we do so without apology. The Christendom curriculum is the only Christian nationalist homeschool program you'll find. We support the right of the European and American peoples to their historic Christian cultures against the globalist leftists who want to destroy those cultures. Not only that, but we provide assigned reading courses for various hot-button subjects in our current culture wars, including feminism, social justice, and cultural Marxism, among others. These reading courses will teach your kids how to survive a social justice warrior attack, how to debate with leftists on social media, how to reform their local churches and communities, and more. We're living in a time of tremendous historical and social change. Christians have the opportunity now to begin building the culture and civilization of the next 1,000 years and beyond. It's an exciting time to be alive. So if you want to help raise the next generation of culture warriors, if you want your children to grow up with a love for Christ's kingdom and for their own nation, while at the same time learning how to defend America and rebuild the West, the easy-to-use Christendom curriculum is for you. Click the Learn More button to get in on the action. And thanks for listening.
On page 68, there was an article by John Tiffany, and he talks about Ian Fleming, the author who had written the James Bond spy novels. But he talks about how Ian Fleming was actually involved with British intelligence during World War II and actually, did a little spycraft himself that helped the Allies to win the battle for Sicily.
Yeah, that was an interesting little story. It was called Operation Mincemeat. And again, nice, short, and sweet story. And evidently the Brits had the idea, or Fleming came up with the idea, to try to convince the Germans that the Allies were going to invade through Greece, because we had a close relationship with the Greek government. And we wanted to convince them that it was going to be elsewhere. I'm missing the actual detail of that story, but let's see. The obvious logical place to invade was via the tiny island of Pantelleria in Sicily. This was indeed the intended invasion route, but the goal of the British was to trick the Germans to believe that we were going to have a two-pronged attack against Greece and Sardinia. So what they did was they found a dead bum in England, and they froze him so he wouldn't, deteriorate. But they planted papers on him that gave him a new identity. He was all of a sudden, he wasn't just a homeless guy they found. They dressed him up, put him in a British uniform, and they gave him papers that planted papers on him, and called him Captain Ewan E.S. Montague. And of course, you have other stuff in your wallet to make it, we call it wallet litter, right? You got a little stub from the theater you went to. Maybe you've got a receipt for the wedding ring you bought or whatever. So they tried to make it as convincing as possible. And the guy's name, by the way, was Glanville Michael. He was really a Welsh tramp. And I think he committed suicide. But anyway, they grabbed the guy, dressed him like a Royal Marine, and then they took his body and they froze it, and they transported it secretly. And by the way, they put a briefcase with a shackle to his wrist, right? And they were going to dump the body off the coast of Spain, where they knew one of the German intelligence chiefs was working pretty high up. But they also did something in this letter in there. They had this thing that was talking about the operation of where the Allies were going to land. Of course, it was always a fake. And to make sure that they knew whether it was opened or not, they put an eyelash somehow in there. So if the eyelash was disturbed in the envelope that the Germans, they figured that the body would be returned to them after being inspected. And they noticed that the eyelash, when they got the body back, they noticed the eyelash was missing. So they thought that the Germans had swallowed the bait. And it turned out that they had swallowed the bait. And even to the point where the battle were for when the Allies were going for Sicily, the Germans were redirecting troops to Sardinia and the Greek area. So it worked. It was a fascinating little story there. That's all I can tell you about that one. It was just the type of thing that how intelligence operations can, even ones as crude as this one, you would have thought this might not work. How decomposed was the body? Evidently, somebody got involved in a local in convincing the Catholic coroner that they should proceed quickly with the funeral, not to do too great of an autopsy because they might have been exposed. But it worked, and like I said, the Germans fell for that one. And so here's just how, say, Ian Fleming, and we all know him and his James Bond stories, had an effect on the Allied invasion and retaking of Europe by the Italian Sicily and the invasion of Italy.
Hello, I'm Tom Strain, Lieutenant Commander-in-Chief of the Sons of Confederate Veterans. The Confederate flag, Confederate symbols, and the reputation of our Confederate ancestors has come under attack. The Sons of Confederate Veterans is actively fending off our detractors, but there is only so much that we can do. We need your help. Contact your local, state, and national elected politicians and tell them that you will not tolerate these attacks on our heritage. You can also visit scv.org, download an application to join us in our fight to preserve our Southern heritage. Visit scv.org today. If you don't have a Confederate ancestor and you are tired of American history disappearing, you can assist us by becoming a friend of the SCV. Please visit scvheritagedefense.org and make a donation to the Heritage Defense Fund. We hope that you will join us in the fight to defend the Confederate soldiers' good name.
And we are just about out of time for this week's TBR Radio Presents the TBR History Hour, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to stop our conversation with Paul Angel here. But don't worry, we will pick it up again, same bat time, same bat channel next week. And we'll finish talking about this exciting May-June issue of the Barnes Review magazine. We'll also take our conversation just a little bit maybe outside of the magazine as well, because Paul just has a lot of great insights on what is going on in the world right now, and in publishing and in politics. And so you'll want to tune in definitely next week. Also, for the last couple weeks, I have been taping some interviews. I did a great interview today that you'll hear here in the next couple weeks with John Remington Graham, or Jack Graham. Jack is a constitutional attorney who has argued cases in the United States, Canada, and Great Britain. In fact, he was one of the attorneys who argued for Quebec when they were in the Canadian Supreme Court, and the Canadian Supreme Court actually ruled in answer to his argument that Quebec could constitutionally secede from the Canadian Union. And he has written a book entitled Blood Money, the Civil War, and the Federal Reserve. So that'll be a great interview, and you'll get to hear that here in the next couple of weeks. And also had a conversation last week that we recorded with Kirk Wood. And Dr. Kirk Wood, for a number of years, was a professor at Alabama State University, and he has written several books on the constitutional doctrine of nullification, and something that's very applicable in our current situation right now. And so I know that you will enjoy that conversation as well. The last show of this month, Lord willing, will be a conversation that I will have with Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Kennedy, and we'll be talking about the Battle of Berlin. But we have some great shows that are coming up here in the next few weeks, and so I know that you'll want to stay tuned to TBR Radio. Over on the other show there, the Dixie Heritage Show, have some great shows coming up. Have Julie Hawkins of the Julie Hawkins Band, who's going to be our guest one day. She has written a War Between the States novel. Actually, she's written a series of novels. I believe there are 4 or 5 books in the series now. And so we talk about those, and have some other great interviews that we have done over the last few weeks there as well that we're about to start sharing with you on air. So I know that you'll want to stay tuned to TBR Radio. Another thing that you want to do is that you want to go to our website, www.barnesreview.org, www.barnesreview.org, and you want to check out, of course, the Barnes Review magazine. If you haven't already done so, you want to get your hands on an issue, either paper or electronic, of the May-June issue of TBR magazine. But you also want to become a subscriber to the Barnes Review. And now is as good a time as any to do that. And of course, you know, we do offer a money-back guarantee. So if you do subscribe and decide, hey, you know what, this isn't what I thought it was going to be, I know you're not going to do that, but in the unlikely event that somebody wants to do that, we do offer a refund. And so, you know, there's no risk to subscribing to the Barnes Review. So you definitely want to try it out. We also have our TBR bookstore there, and you'll want to check that out as well. Hopefully, you're going outside. Hopefully, you're getting some sunshine. Hopefully, you're doing some things outside now as the weather is warming up. And, you know, hopefully you're just, like I said, soaking in the sunshine and enjoying the beauty of God's green earth. I know that it was kind of hard to do that a couple weeks ago there because we had that strange May cold snap. But I think we're past that now. And so if you're not already doing it, go outside and just enjoy nature. To encourage that, I'm going to take the camera outside and we are going to play just a few moments of basketball. If you're watching this on YouTube, you'll be able to see it. Oh, by the way, if you're watching on YouTube, be sure to click like and subscribe. Of course, if you're just listening on the radio, all you're going to hear is net. I did not bring the tripod with me, so I am having to hold the camera and the phone and make the shot at the same time. But let's see if I can sink this free throw here. And it went in. So get out there, have some fun, play some golf, play some tennis, play some basketball, go out in the ocean and take a swim. I'm daring my wife that I'm going to jump into the Wacomico River. I'm literally 600 yards away from it right now. It's just that close. She tells me I'm going to regret it. Apparently the water is pretty brackish. I don't know. I guess I'm about to find out. But hey, get out there, have some fun, spend some time with your family. And, you know, if there's somebody out there telling you that you can't do it anyways. I guess I just made that a call to civil disobedience. Who would have ever thought that the day would come in America when going out and shooting hoops or playing softball or, taking a swim would be an act of civil disobedience. But I guess that's where we find ourselves today in modern America. Heil Hogan.